A stepmother's cruelest joke was meant to end in humiliation. Lady Margaret Vaughn dressed her stepdaughter in rags, sealed a mocking letter with red wax, and sent her walking through a violent storm straight into the hands of the county's most feared duke, a man rumors called a monster. She wanted him to roar. She wanted Anna thrown into the mud so she could weep prettily about the poor, mad duke who terrorized an innocent girl. But behind those iron gates, soaked to the bone and trembling on his threshold, Anna watched the duke cross his study in silence and pull out a chair before he said a single word. Why would a man everyone feared choose kindness first? Stay with us to find out what happened next. Let's take a moment before we begin, because today's story follows Anna Vaughn, a woman sent to a duke's door in rags as a cruel prank and handed a chair by the fire instead of a lecture. If you've ever walked into a room bracing for judgment and found gentleness waiting there instead, tell us about it in the comments below. Mrs. Margaret Vaughn sent her stepdaughter to the reclusive Duke of Wiltshire wearing a coat fit for a scullery maid and a letter dripping with contempt. It was meant to be the cruelest joke of the season, a plain, penniless spinster delivered to the doorstep of a man the county called the Ice Duke, so that Margaret could laugh about it over her Madeira for months to come. She never imagined that the monster of Ravensmoor Hall would rise from behind his desk, cross the room in silence, and pull out a chair before he said a single word. It was the first week of July, and the rain had not stopped since dawn. It came down in long grey ropes, hissing against the roof of the hired gig, pooling in the ruts of the lane until the road itself seemed to dissolve into the surrounding fields. Anna Vaughn sat with her spine perfectly straight, her gloved hands folded so tightly in her lap that she could feel her own pulse beating against her knuckles. She would not slouch. She would not shiver, though the cold had long since crept past her skin and settled somewhere near her bones. Slouching, shivering, these were things a person did when they still expected comfort. Anna had stopped expecting comfort 7 years ago. The winter her father died, and Margaret Vaughn discovered exactly how little use she had for a stepdaughter who came without a dowry. The coat she wore had once been a rich hunter green, a gift from her father the Christmas before his final illness. Now it was the color of a bruise, the nap worn thin at the elbows, one cuff frayed to threads where a careless moth had feasted years ago. Beneath it, her dress was plain grey wool, high-necked and unadorned, the sort of dress a lady's companion wore, not the sort of dress in which a gentleman's daughter called upon a duke. That, of course, was precisely the point. "You will go, Anna," Margaret had announced 3 days earlier, over a breakfast of chocolate and warm rolls that Anna had not been offered. "The Duke of Wiltshire has written to every family of consequence in 3 counties, demanding a list of eligible women he might interview for a wife, as though we are cattle at a fair. I have recommended you most warmly." Her smile had been all teeth. "You are 25. You cost this household a great deal to feed and clothe for a woman who will clearly never marry. Let the Duke have the use of you, if he can stomach it." Anna had not needed to break the heavy red wax on the letter tucked in her pocket to know what it said. She could guess the words as easily as she could guess. The weather, nervous, plain, tediously dull, entirely without prospects, and grateful for any attention a gentleman might spare her. Margaret had spent 7 years perfecting the art of the compliment. That was, in fact, a knife. The rumors about the Duke had reached even the Vaughn's modest drawing-room. They said he had returned from the war on the peninsula with a shattered leg and a temper to match. They said he had dismissed his entire London staff in a single furious afternoon. They said his own aunt would not sit at table with him unless a footman stood between them. Margaret intended for Anna to walk into that temper wearing rags, so that when the Duke roared and turned her out into the mud, Margaret could weep prettily to the whole county about the poor, mad Duke who had terrorized her innocent stepdaughter, and never once mention that she had dressed Anna for exactly that outcome. The gig lurched through a rut deep enough to swallow a wheel, and Anna's temple struck the wooden frame hard enough to draw a hiss through her teeth. She pressed 2 fingers to the spot and did not cry out. Crying out required an audience who cared, and she had none. Only endure it, she told herself, the way she had told herself 1,000 times before. Let him shout. Let him send me back in the rain. I will walk to the village and take a position sewing, and I will never again have to hear Margaret's voice at breakfast. Through the streaming glass, the gates of Ravensmoor Hall rose out of the storm like the ribs of some enormous drowned creature. Twin pillars of black stone, iron scrollwork rusted to lace, and atop each pillar a carved hawk with wings half spread, watching the road with blind stone eyes. The driver did not take her past them. End of the road, miss. He called through the small hatch, hauling the horses to a stop with more relief than apology in his voice. Drive's washed to soup. You'll want to walk it from here. Anna did not argue. She had no coin left to argue with. She climbed down into mud that swallowed her boots to the ankle, and the gig rattled away before she had even found her balance, leaving her entirely alone before the vast dark silhouette of the house. Ravensmoor Hall did not look like a home. It looked like something that had grown out of the hillside rather than been built upon it. Long wings of dark stone, narrow windows like closed eyes. Not a single curl of smoke rising from any chimney to suggest a living soul within. Anna stood at the foot of the drive with the rain running in icy threads down the back of her neck, and for one long moment, she considered simply turning around and walking back into the storm, toward whatever waited for a woman with no home and no name worth speaking. The wind carried the smell of wet stone and turned earth, and somewhere far off a rook called once, twice, and fell silent, as though even the birds had judged the weather unworthy of comment. Anna thought of her father's voice, low and steady, the way he used to say, "Chin up, my girl. The storm always tires before you do." A small, foolish comfort, 7 years buried, and yet it rose in her now, with startling clarity, enough to straighten her spine another half-inch against the driving rain. Instead, she began to walk. By the time she reached the great oak doors, studded with black iron and carved with a hawk's head knocker, her teeth had begun to chatter so violently, she could not have spoken even if there had been anyone to speak to. She lifted the heavy ring and let it fall. The sound rolled away into the rain like the toll of some distant bell. The door opened on hinges that groaned like a living thing in pain, and Anna found herself looking not at a sneering footman, ready to turn away a beggar, but at an elderly man of perfect, unbending posture, his face so composed it might have been carved from the same grey stone as the house. This, though Anna did not yet know his name, was Grimshaw, 63, who had butlered Ravensmoor through 2 dukes and 1 long, grieving silence, and who had long ago concluded that very little in this world merited an expression. He looked at her. He looked at the puddle already forming around her ruined boots. His expression did not so much as flicker. "I am Anna Vaughn," she managed, her voice thin and rasping, nothing at all like the cool, cultured tone Margaret had drilled into her for a decade. "I have come to see His Grace, the Duke of Wiltshire." She drew the letter from her sodden pocket with a hand that shook so badly she nearly dropped it, and held it out. The butler, for surely that was what he was, took the letter between two fingers, his mouth tightening very slightly at the damp parchment. He did not ask why she looked like something dragged from a mill pond. He simply stepped back and opened the door wider. "His Grace is in the study, Miss Vaughn." "This way." Anna blinked rainwater from her lashes, too startled to move for a moment. She had braced herself so thoroughly for rejection that being admitted felt like missing a step in the dark. She followed him inside. The entrance hall was vast and cold, smelling of beeswax and old stone, black and white marble stretching toward a staircase, broad enough to march an army up. There were no flowers, no cheerful clutter, nothing but silence and the echo of Anna's ruined boots, squelch, 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 against the polished floor. She felt the heat of shame climb her throat with every step, imagining the muddy trail she left behind her, imagining Margaret's delighted laughter, if she could see it. The butler stopped before a pair of tall doors, and without knocking, opened them. "Miss Anna Vaughn, Your Grace." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the doorway to face whatever waited within. The study was nothing like the hall. Books climbed every wall to a ceiling lost in shadow, and a fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand in, throwing gold light across a room that smelled of leather, ink, and wood smoke. And there, half turned from a desk buried under ledgers, was a man Anna understood at once could only be the Duke. Nathaniel Sinclair, 29, the 5th Duke of Wiltshire. A man whose silence, the county whispered, commanded more obedience than most men's shouting. Did not look up at once. He was not a monster. He had no scars twisting his face, no mad light in his eyes. He was simply large, tall enough that he seemed to fill the room without trying, broad through the shoulder in a way his plain linen shirt and unfastened waistcoat did nothing to disguise. His hair was dark, threaded at the temples with silver too early for a man who could not yet be 30. His eyes, when they found her, were a pale gray black, the color of a sky before snow, and they missed nothing. Not her ruined coat, not her chattering jaw, not the water running from the hem of her skirt to pool, slow and damning, upon a carpet that looked older than the house itself. Anna lifted her chin. If he meant to roar, let him roar. She was too cold and too tired to flinch from it. He did not roar. He rose instead, slowly, with the aid of a heavy cane and a stiffness in one leg he did not trouble to hide, and crossed the room toward her without a word. Anna's whole body tensed, certain, at last, that this silence was only the drawing of breath before the storm broke. He walked past her. He went instead to a great wingback chair set close by the fire, gripped its arm, and dragged it, with a grunt of effort, the wood scraping loud across the floorboards, even nearer to the flames. Then he turned, pointed one long, ink-stained finger at the seat, and said the only word he had spoken since she entered the room. "Sit." It was not a request. Anna stared at him, too astonished to obey. Every instinct she had cultivated over 7 years of enduring Margaret's house told her this was the moment before the blow. That kindness offered first was only cruelty with better manners. "Your Grace, you are dripping onto a rug that has survived 3 generations of Sinclairs and one particularly enthusiastic hound," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone entirely without heat. "And you are shaking hard enough that I can hear your teeth from here. Sit down, Miss Vaughn, before you fall down, and spare us both the tedium of explaining a corpse to the magistrate." Something in the flat, dry absurdity of it loosened the knot behind Anna's ribs just enough that her legs carried her, unbidden, to the chair. She sank into it, and the heat of the fire struck her soaked clothes like something almost violent, a warmth so sudden it hurt. He did not watch her. He turned instead to the window, giving her, she realized, with a strange, aching gratitude, the privacy to shudder and gasp and blink back the sting in her eyes without an audience for it. He rang a bell by the glass, and when the butler appeared, said only, "Tea, Grimshaw, and a thick towel, and something more substantial than biscuits." "At once, Your Grace." The doors closed. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Not the held breath before a blow, but something Anna had no name for. Grimshaw returned with unnerving speed, bearing a battered silver pot, a plain earthenware mug, and a plate piled with buttered bread instead of the delicate wafers Margaret's drawing-room favored. A heated woolen towel was draped over the back of Anna's chair. The Duke waited until the doors closed again before he crossed to the tray himself, poured the tea black and thick with honey, and pressed the mug into Anna's still unsteady hands. "Drink," he said. "All of it." She drank. It tasted like being pulled back from the edge of something. He lowered himself into the chair opposite, propping his cane against the arm with the wince of a man who had long since stopped expecting his own body to cooperate with him. "Now," he said, folding his hands over his waistcoat, "perhaps you would care to explain why Miss Vaughn, a woman, I am told, once returned an entire bolt of Belgian lace because it was insufficiently expensive, has sent her stepdaughter to my door in a coat that has clearly lost several arguments with moths during the worst storm of the season." Anna's throat tightened. She had spent a decade learning to smooth over Margaret's cruelties in company, to swallow every barb before it could be seen. But the fire had thawed something in her, besides her fingers, and she found she had no strength left for smoothing anything over. "My stepmother sent me here as a joke, Your Grace." He did not so much as blink. "A joke?" "She despises you," Anna said, the words coming faster now, unstoppable as the rain outside. "She despises the rumors that follow your name, and your refusal to attend her assemblies. And most of all, she despises that you dared to advertise for a wife, as though ordering coal for the winter. I am 25, unmarried, without dowry or connection, entirely dependent upon her charity. She dressed me like this, and sent me into a storm, so that you would take one look at me, understand precisely the insult she intended, and cast me out. Then she would tell the whole county how the mad Duke terrorized her poor, unfortunate stepdaughter, and no one would ever think to ask why she'd sent me to you in rags in the first place." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. Then he reached into his waistcoat and produced the letter, her letter, its wax seal already broken. "She describes you," he said, "as tragically plain and of a nervous disposition, in urgent want of a firm hand." He looked up. "You do not appear nervous to me, Miss Vaughn. You appear furious. I am cold, Your Grace. Fury requires energy I do not currently possess." A sound escaped him, short, rough, entirely unexpected. It took Anna a full second to recognize it as a laugh. He leaned forward and fed the letter to the fire without ceremony, and they watched together as the wax seal blackened and curled and finally dissolved into ash. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, settling back, "has considerably overestimated both her wit and her understanding of me. She is not alone in that. The county believes you throw footmen from windows for sport, only the ones who oversalt the soup." His mouth twitched, the barest ghost of a smile, gone almost before it arrived, but it transformed his tired, severe face into something Anna had to look away from, startled by the sudden unwelcome flutter beneath her ribs. "You see, Miss Vaughn," he said, and the humor drained from his voice, leaving something more deliberate in its place. "Your stepmother's joke has gone rather badly wrong. Because I did not advertise for a debutante who will weep if I raise my voice or faint at the sight of a ledger. I have a crumbling estate, tenants who need looking after, a leg that aches like the devil in weather such as this, and an aunt who has opinions about all of it. I require a partner with a spine." His gaze traveled over her, still dripping, still upright despite everything. "You walked 2 miles through a downpour, knowing precisely what insult you carried with you. You sat in my chair, drank my tea, and told me to my face that I was the punchline of your stepmother's joke. You are not afraid of me. I have lived 7 years under Margaret Vaughn's roof, Your Grace," Anna said quietly. "There is very little left that frightens me." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite tenderness, not yet, but the first careful edge of it. "Then perhaps," he said, "we ought to discuss the terms of a marriage." The fire popped loudly in the grate. Anna set down her mug with a hand that was no longer shaking from cold alone. "I beg your pardon? You require an escape from a woman who uses you as an ornament for her own cruelty," he said, laying the matter out with the same flat precision he might have used for a column of figures. "I require a duchess, capable of running a household, managing a staff, and enduring my aunt without dissolving into tears at breakfast. I am not offering you sonnets, Miss Vaughn. I am offering you a home, complete security, and an allowance generous enough to make Mrs. Vaughn choke on her chocolate each time she thinks of it. In exchange, you would manage Ravensmoor and see that I am left in peace by the local gossips." He paused. "It is not romantic, I make no claim otherwise. It was not a declaration of love. It was cold, practical, entirely without poetry. And it was, Anna thought, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in 7 years. He had offered her a chair before he had offered her a single accusation. He had given her tea instead of a lecture. He looked at her not as a joke to be endured, but as a person to be reckoned with. "Your Grace," she said, sitting up straighter in the great leather chair, her voice steadier than she had believed it could be. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." They were married 11 days later, in the small stone chapel at Ravensmoor, with no flowers and no music, and only Grimshaw and a terrified young vicar to witness it. Anna wore a gown of deep plum velvet, chosen by the Duke himself over a seamstress's protests, dark colors, stiff fabric, high collars, he had instructed. She is not a doll to be trimmed in lace. She is about to become a duchess. Dress her as one builds a fortress. When he slid the heavy signet ring onto her finger, his hand was steady and warm, and he held hers the way one might seal a contract of great importance, not to claim, but to promise. Outside, the same rain that had followed her up the drive a fortnight before drummed softly against the stained glass, but inside the little chapel it sounded almost gentle now, more lullaby than threat, and Anna found she could not summon a trace of the dread she had once associated with storms. "I will," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I will," he echoed, and something in his low voice made the words sound less like a legal formality and more like a vow he intended to keep with his whole chest. By the time the ink was dry, Anna Vaughn no longer existed. Anna Sinclair, Duchess of Wiltshire, turned from the altar and asked Grimshaw, without preamble, for the household keys. Ravensmore Hall had been neglected in the particular way that only grief neglects a house, not through poverty, but through a master who had simply stopped noticing whether the fires were lit. Anna noticed everything. Within a fortnight, she had dismissed a housekeeper who had been quietly selling the silver, promoted a sharp-eyed maid in her place, ordered coal by the ton, and set half the household airing out rugs that had not seen daylight in a decade. She did not rule with shouting. She ruled the way a woman rules who has spent 7 years learning exactly how a household ought not to be run, and has finally been given the keys to prove it. Nathaniel, for he had asked her, on their second evening, to stop calling him Your Grace in private, and she had discovered she rather liked the shape of his given name in her mouth, stayed largely out of her way, buried in ledgers and estate business, his bad leg keeping him close to the fire on the worst days. But he watched. He watched the way the staff stopped shuffling and began to move with purpose. He watched the color return to rooms that had been gray with dust for years. Not everyone in the house watched with pleasure. Lady Frances Sinclair, 61, the late Duke's unmarried sister and the only daughter of a Duke ever to have voluntarily remained at Ravensmore past the age of 30, had lived in the house since before Anna was born and considered its every custom, down to the precise fold of a napkin, a matter of personal jurisdiction. She made her opinion of the new Duchess known within the first week over a dinner where every course arrived to a small, pointed silence. Cecilia would never have permitted the second footman to wear mismatched livery. Frances observed to no one in particular over the fish. Cecilia had an eye for these things. Anna set down her fork. "Who is Cecilia, Lady Frances?" The silence that followed was answer enough, but it was Nathaniel who finally spoke, his voice carefully even. "Lady Cecilia Hartley. My aunt refers to my former betrothed. The engagement ended 3 years ago." "Ended," Frances said crisply, "when Cecilia found a Marcus with rather less scandal attached to his name and considerably more use of both his legs." She did not look at Anna as she said it, but she did not need to. Anna felt the barb land precisely where it was aimed. But 7 years under Margaret's roof had taught her one useful skill above all others: never to let a cruelty see that it had struck home. How fortunate for the Marquess, she said mildly, to have secured a lady of such discerning taste in liveries, and returned to her fish while across the table Nathaniel's mouth twitched with something that was not quite a smile and was, nonetheless, entirely warm. It was in the weeks that followed that Anna began to understand the shape of the man she had married, not through declarations, for he made none, but through the small, accumulating evidence of a person who noticed things. She found, one bitter morning, that someone had moved her favorite chair in the small study nearest the kitchen directly into the path of the morning sun, though she had never once mentioned that she liked to sit there. She found a fresh coal fire already burning in her bedchamber each night, before she thought to ring for it. She found, tucked beneath her ledger one evening, a heavy fountain pen of dark polished wood and silver, without a card, without explanation, only the quiet fact of it, waiting for her. "Thank you," she said, when she found him in the study doorway, leaning on his cane, watching her turn the pen over in her ink-stained fingers. "For what?" he asked, entirely too innocent for a man whose ears had gone faintly red. "For nothing at all, apparently," she said, and did not miss the way his mouth curved before he turned away. There was, too, the matter of Bran, an enormous, grey-muzzled hound with one clouded eye and a limp nearly as pronounced as his master's, who had regarded every member of the household with weary suspicion for years, and who, on Anna's third day at Ravensmoor, had walked directly across the drawing-room, laid his great head in her lap, and refused to move for the better part of an hour. "He does not do that," Nathaniel said, watching from the doorway with an expression Anna could not quite name. "Perhaps he has better judgment than the rest of your household," Anna said, scratching behind one ragged ear, and Bran sighed with such profound contentment that even Francis, passing in the hall, paused to stare. There was an afternoon, too, when a sudden squall caught Anna half a mile from the house, while she was inspecting the eastern drainage ditches herself, skirts already heavy with mud, when she heard the uneven rhythm of a cane crossing the field toward her at a pace that must have cost him a great deal in pain. Nathaniel said nothing about the folly of walking out in weather like this. He simply shrugged out of his greatcoat and settled it over her shoulders without asking, the wool still warm from his own body, smelling of wood smoke and horse, and something underneath that she had already, without quite noticing, come to think of as simply him. They walked back to the house, together in silence, her hand tucked, without either of them deciding it ought to be there, into the crook of his arm, steadying him as much as he steadied her. And neither of them mentioned afterward how neither had wanted to let go before they reached the door. There was an evening, some weeks later, when Frances insisted, with the particular ruthlessness of a woman who had appointed herself arbiter of the county's opinion of the new Duchess, that Anna must learn to waltz before the spring assemblies, and Nathaniel, overhearing, had set down his ledger with an expression of great long-suffering, and offered himself as instructor, on the grounds that a duchess who could not dance would reflect poorly upon them all. He danced badly, his legs stiff and unwilling, counting the steps aloud under his breath, like a man solving an equation rather than feeling a rhythm. And Anna had laughed so hard at his scowling concentration that she trod on his good foot twice, and he had declared with mock solemnity that he was seriously reconsidering the entire marriage. Neither of them noticed how long they had gone on dancing, badly, long after the lesson had any reasonable excuse to continue, until Frances cleared her throat pointedly from the doorway, and neither of them could quite meet the other's eye for the rest of the evening, cheeks warm for reasons that had nothing to do with exertion. And there was the night Anna cut her hand on a broken pane while airing out the old nursery, a shallow wound but a bleeding one. And Nathaniel had appeared in the doorway, so quickly she wondered if he had been listening for her throughout the house, and had knelt before her without a word, wrapping her palm in his own handkerchief with hands that were, for all their scars and roughness, astonishingly gentle. He had not let go of her hand once the wound was bound. He had simply held it a moment longer than the task required, his thumb tracing once, absently, over her knuckles. And Anna had felt her pulse leap in a way that had nothing at all to do with pain, and neither of them had spoken of it, though something unspoken passed between them all the same, warm and startled, and entirely too large for either of them to name just yet. Then there was the morning of the porridge, a small, foolish thing that Anna would remember, years later, more clearly than half the grander moments of that autumn. She had risen before the household to test whether the new cook's porridge was fit to be served to tenantants who came in from the cold fields, and had found Nathaniel already there, ahead of her, standing over the pot in his shirt sleeves, with an expression of profound betrayal, having apparently decided the kitchen fire needed tending and made an unholy mess of both the porridge and himself in the attempt. "It has gone entirely wrong," he informed her, with the grave dignity of a general reporting a lost battle, gesturing at a pot that had indeed gone entirely wrong, thick and scorched and faintly smoking. "I do not know what I have done to it. You have burned it, Your Grace. I am aware that I have burned it, Anna. I am asking how." "By standing over it looking severe instead of stirring it," she said, taking the spoon from his hand before he could protest, and was rewarded by the rare, startled sound of his genuine laugh, not the dry huff he gave to a clever remark, but something fuller, younger, that seemed to surprise him as much as it delighted her. He did not leave the kitchen after that. He stayed, leaning against the great scarred table with his arms crossed, offering unhelpful commentary on her technique, and by the time the porridge was rescued and the tenants fed, the kitchen staff had grown so accustomed to finding their duke underfoot at dawn that no one so much as blinked when it happened again the following week. And the week after that. They did not speak of love. They spoke of butcher's accounts and drainage on the eastern fields, and the scandalous price of good coal, and somewhere beneath the ledgers and the arguments, and the long, companionable silences by the fire, something warm and unnamed had begun, quietly to grow. The trouble began with the harvest accounts. Mr. Vincent Thorne, 32, Ravensmoor's land steward, had managed the estate's tenant rents for 6 years under the previous duke's inattention, wore his authority with the easy confidence of a man never once questioned, and did not care in the least for a new duchess who read every column of every ledger with her own eyes. Anna noticed the discrepancy on a wet Tuesday in October. £40 unaccounted for in the autumn rents, precisely the sort of sum that might vanish unnoticed under a less careful hand, but not under hers. She said nothing to Nathaniel at first. She went instead to the tenant families herself, in the gig, in the rain that seemed to follow every important moment of her life at Ravensmoor, and asked quiet questions until the shape of the theft became clear. The Cobb family, 3 fields over, showed her a receipt for rent, paid in full, that did not match the sum recorded in Vincent Thorne's own hand. Old Mrs. Aldous, who had farmed the northern acreage for 40 years and trusted no one, produced from beneath a loose floorboard a small tin box of her own careful tallies, kept for her own peace of mind, and they told a story the estate ledgers did not. Anna sat at each humble kitchen table with her boots damp and her fingers stained with borrowed ink, and felt something steady and grim settle over her. Not fear this time, but the particular clarity of a woman who has finally been given the power to protect what is hers and does not intend to waste it. What she did not expect was Lady Cecilia Hartley's carriage, arriving at Ravensmoor 3 days later, ostensibly to pay a neighborly call upon an old friend's aunt. Lady Cecilia Hartley, 27, celebrated for 3 seasons running as the loveliest woman in 3 counties before her sudden, scandal-tinged elevation to a marquess's side, was, Anna conceded privately, precisely as lovely as the county's gossip promised, golden-haired, exquisitely dressed, with a laugh that filled a room and eyes that missed nothing. She took tea in the drawing-room with Francis, complimented Anna's gown with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and remarked, entirely too casually, that she had heard such concerning things about the state of the estate's finances since the wedding. "How curious," Anna said, "that you should hear of matters I have only just discovered myself." Cecilia's smile did not waver, but something behind it sharpened. "The county talks, Your Grace. People do worry when a man of Nathaniel's fortune marries so suddenly, so conveniently." It was, Anna understood at once, not idle gossip at all. It was a warning, delivered with a teacup in hand and a smile like a blade. Later, seeing Cecilia's carriage away down the drive, Anna noticed, and thought little of it, at the time, that it did not turn toward the main road at all, but toward the lane that led past the old rent office, where Vincent Thorne still kept a room above the stables while he settled his affairs. It was only afterward, looking back, that she understood she had watched the whole conspiracy pass beneath her window, and mistaken it for nothing more than a shortcut. 2 days later, Vincent Thorne fled his position without a word of notice, vanishing from the county entirely. But not before a rumor had already begun circulating in the village that it was the new Duchess herself who had been quietly diverting funds, and that the steward had fled rather than be blamed for a mistress's crime. Nathaniel found her in the study that evening, the ledgers spread before her, her face pale in the candlelight. "You have heard, then," she said, without looking up. "I have heard a great deal of nonsense." He crossed the room, lowered himself into the chair opposite, and waited until she met his eyes. "I do not believe a word of it, Anna. Everyone else will." "Everyone else," he said, "has not spent 3 months watching you, account for every farthing that passes through this house, as though your own life depended upon its accuracy." He reached across the desk and closed his hand over hers, warm and solid and entirely without hesitation. "I know what you are, Anna. Rumor does not change it." It should have comforted her more than it did, but something in the careful way he said it. "I know what you are," snagged at a thought she could not quite untangle, a suspicion that had been gathering at the edges of her mind for weeks and had no shape yet, only weight. "Nathaniel," she said slowly, "why did you truly write that notice? You could have had any woman in 3 counties send her card. Why demand a list from families you had never called upon? Why word it so strangely that only a woman desperate enough, humiliated enough, would ever be sent to you?" For the first time since she had known him, Nathaniel Sinclair did not have an answer ready. The truth, when it finally surfaced, did not come from Nathaniel at all. It came from Francis. 3 nights later, in the heat of an argument that had been building since Cecilia's visit. "You would defend her so fiercely," Francis snapped. "And yet you have never told her the truth of how she came to be here at all. Do you imagine she will thank you for it, Nathaniel? When she learns you have been watching over her since she was a girl of 17. The room went very still. Anna set down her cup with exaggerated care. "What is she talking about?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a long moment Anna thought he might simply refuse to answer. But then, slowly, he began to speak, each word dragged out as though it cost him something physical. 8 years ago, on the road outside Bath, a young Anna Vaughn, not yet 18, had sat beside her ailing father in a carriage that had broken an axle in a snowstorm, and a stranger on horseback, a young officer home from the peninsula, his own leg not yet ruined, had stopped, sent for a surgeon, paid for the repairs, and seen them safely to an inn, all without ever giving his name. Anna did not remember his face. She had been half frozen and frightened for her father's life, and the stranger had vanished before dawn. But Nathaniel had never forgotten hers. Her father had lingered another year after that snowbound night before the same weak chest finally took him. And it was in that year, and every year since, that Nathaniel had followed the family's circumstances quietly, through solicitors and discreet inquiries, watching from a distance as her father's debts mounted. And, after his death, as Mrs. Vaughn's cruelty grew, he had paid, anonymously, for small things, a doctor's bill here, a schoolmaster's fee there, never once revealing the source. And when word reached him, through the same quiet channels, of precisely how Margaret meant to dispose of her unwanted stepdaughter, he had written his strange, deliberately insulting notice, worded exactly so that a woman like Margaret would see in it a perfect instrument of cruelty, and send Anna straight into his hands. "I did not want you to come to me out of gratitude," he said finally, his voice rough. "I did not want to be a debt you felt obliged to repay. I told myself I would simply see you safe, and say nothing, and let whatever grew between us grow honestly. But I have lied to you by omission since the day you walked into my study, soaked to the bone, and I do not know how to ask your forgiveness for that." Anna sat very still, the fire popping in the grate, feeling something inside her chest crack open. Not with rage, not entirely, but with a grief she had not expected. The grief of discovering that even the truest seeming kindness of her marriage had a hidden architecture she had never been permitted to see. "You built our entire marriage," she said quietly, "on a secret you decided I did not deserve to know. Anna, do not." She rose, her hands unsteady now, for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. "I need air, Nathaniel. I need to think, and I cannot do either while you are looking at me like that." She left him standing by the fire and did not look back to see the way his composure, finally, entirely, broke. She did not run far, only to the small stone folly at the edge of the gardens, where Bran found her within the hour and settled his grey head against her knee with a patience that asked for nothing. Anna sat in the cold with her hand buried in his fur and turned the truth over and over, examining it from every angle she could bear. He had lied. But he had lied to protect her, not to use her. Every secret kindness had been given freely, expecting nothing, long before he had any hope of her hand at all. He had rescued her twice, in fact, once as a stranger on a snowy road, and once as a duke with a strange, insulting letter that had somehow, impossibly, turned into the safest home she had ever known. It did not erase the hurt of having been managed without her knowledge. But it was not, she understood slowly, the same thing as cruelty. She was still sitting there, cold and thoughtful, when she heard the uneven rhythm of his cane on the gravel path. He did not sit beside her. He stood a little apart, in the dark, and said only, "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am only asking you not to leave Ravensmoor believing I ever once regarded you as an obligation. You were never a debt to me, Anna. You were the only thing in 7 years I did not have to force myself to care about." Anna looked up at him for a long moment, the moonlight silvering the gray at his temples, and felt the last hard edge of her anger soften into something more complicated and far more forgiving. "Tell me the rest of it," she said quietly. "All of it tonight, so there is nothing left in the dark between us. What else have you arranged, Nathaniel Sinclair, without troubling to inform me?" He came and sat beside her on the cold stone bench, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, close enough that she could feel the faint tremor of effort it cost his bad leg to fold himself down beside her rather than stand looming above. The schoolmaster's fee, as I have said. A physician sent to your village the winter you had the fever, though I was told. He claimed to be passing through by chance. A word to a solicitor, once, when I heard your father's creditors meant to seize the last of the furniture before the funeral had even been held. He paused. I have never once regretted any of it. I have only regretted that I did not trust you enough to tell you, and let you decide for yourself what to make of a man who could not stop watching over a girl he met for 1/4 of an hour on a snowy road. That is not nothing to decide, Anna said. For a woman who has spent 7 years being told her only worth was the trouble she cost. Then decide it now, he said, with everything laid bare, and no more secrets standing between us to decide it for you. You will tell me everything from now on, she said, all of it. Every secret kindness, every quiet arrangement. I will not be managed again, Nathaniel, not even out of love, everything. He agreed, and it was, she thought, the most solemn vow he had made her yet. Autumn hardened slowly into winter. The estate settled, by unspoken agreement, into a careful, healing quiet. Nathaniel true to his word, holding back nothing further, however small. Anna slower to anger and quicker to laugh than she had been even in October. By the time the first frost silvered the park, the county had all but forgotten there had ever been a rumor of missing rents, and Frances had begun, with visible relish, planning the one event Ravensmoor had not hosted in a decade. The 12th night ball at Ravensmoor was the first grand event the estate had hosted in a decade, and Frances, despite herself, had thrown herself into its preparation with a fervor that suggested she had simply been waiting for an excuse. The great hall blazed with candlelight for the first time in Anna's memory of the house, and half the county arrived eager to inspect the mysterious new duchess with their own eyes. Cecilia Hartley arrived among them, resplendent in ivory silk, and made directly for Anna within the first quarter hour. How resourceful you have proven, Your Grace, she said, loudly enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear. First, a convenient marriage to a broken duke, desperate enough to overlook your circumstances, and now, I hear, £40 gone missing from the very estate you claim to manage so devotedly. One wonders how a woman with no dowry of her own affords such very fine new gowns. The hall's chatter dimmed by degrees as heads began to turn. Anna felt the old instinct rise, to smooth it over, to shrink, to let the cruelty pass unanswered, as she had 1,000 cruelties before. She set it aside. How strange, she said, her voice carrying clearly, that you should know the exact sum missing from a private household ledger, Lady Cecilia, when the theft was reported to no one beyond this house and the departed steward himself. The color drained from Cecilia's face by degrees. It was Nathaniel who stepped forward then, his cane striking the marble floor with a sound that silenced the last murmuring corner of the hall. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. I have, in the past week, he said, corresponded at some length with a magistrate in Bristol, where Mr. Vincent Thorne was discovered attempting to deposit £40 of stolen rent under a false name. In an account, I am reliably informed, opened at the recommendation of a certain lady of his acquaintance, who has for some months carried considerable debts of her own, his grey eyes fixed on Cecilia without a flicker of mercy. I wonder, Lady Cecilia, whether the assembled company might be interested to learn precisely how those debts came to be settled, and by whom, in the months since our own engagement ended. Cecilia's mouth opened. No sound emerged. "You will forgive me," Nathaniel continued, his tone dropping to something almost gentle, which somehow made it more devastating still, "if I decline to make you a public villain tonight. I find I have grown weary of scandal. But you will leave my home, and my wife's name will not cross your lips again in any drawing room in this county. Or I shall find myself considerably less merciful in the retelling." Cecilia fled the hall within minutes, her ivory silk a pale blur through the front doors, and did not return. It was Frances, unexpectedly, who crossed the hall to Anna once the whispers had begun to soften into something closer to admiration. "I owe you an apology," the old woman said stiffly, as though the words cost her a physical effort. "I compared you to a woman who would have let this house crumble around her rather than dirty her hands with an honest ledger. I was a fool, and worse, I was unkind, and I am not accustomed to admitting either." "You are forgiven, Lady Frances," Anna said, gently, "on the condition that you teach me, before the spring assemblies, precisely how you arrange liveries so correctly." Something that might, in a better light, have been called a smile crossed the old woman's face. "I believe," she said, "that we shall get along very well after all." Across the room, Nathaniel watched his wife laugh, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the kind she had never once allowed herself under Margaret Vaughn's roof, and felt something in his chest settle into place at last, like a door long jammed, finally swinging free. He crossed the hall to her, ignoring the curious eyes of half the county, and extended his hand. "I do not dance well, Your Grace," he admitted, low enough for her ears alone. "My leg has strong opinions on the subject." "Then we shall dance badly together," Anna said, and placed her hand in his. "I find I have grown rather fond of doing difficult things in your company." They did not dance well. They laughed through most of it, Nathaniel's cane abandoned against a chair, his hand steady at her waist, despite the uneven rhythm of his steps, and not one person in that glittering hall believed any longer that the Duke of Wiltshire was a monster, or that his Duchess was anything less than the finest thing that had ever happened to Ravensmoor. Even Frances, watching from beside the punch bowl with a glass she did not drink from, found herself smiling in a manner she would later deny entirely, should anyone be so impertinent as to mention it. Mrs. Margaret Vaughn arrived a fortnight later, having heard, eventually, and to her evident horror, that the stepdaughter she had dispatched as an insult now presided over Ravensmoor Hall as its duchess. She came expecting to find Anna destitute or disgraced, and found instead a woman seated by a roaring fire in dark blue silk, pouring tea with the composure of a queen holding court. "Married," Margaret said, when the truth was laid before her, her carefully cultivated poise cracking down the middle. "To that reclusive brute. He accepted you out of spite for me, nothing more." "He accepted me," Anna said, setting down the pot with a steady hand, "because he recognized worth where you saw only an inconvenience to be rid of. You sent him a cruel joke." "Margaret," he simply declined to laugh at it. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway before Margaret could summon a reply. Leaning on his cane, his gray eyes fixed upon her with the cold, patient focus of a man who had waited a long time for exactly this moment. "You will find, Mrs. Vaughn," he said quietly, "that I hold rather more influence over your late husband's remaining debts than you have perhaps been informed. I purchased the note some months ago, A practical decision. Nothing more. My wife has asked that I not call it in, provided you never speak her name in company again with anything less than respect. His mouth curved, faint and dangerous. I find myself, on this one point, considerably less generous than she is. See that you do not test either of us. Margaret left Ravensmoor that afternoon without another word, and never troubled the Duchess of Wiltshire again. A year of warm fires. Ravensmoor Hall, 1 year later, no longer resembled the cold. Silent house Anna had first walked into soaked to the bone. Fires burned in every hearth from October to April. Fresh flowers, Frances's doing, entirely, filled the entrance hall each week, and somewhere beneath the great staircase, 3 of Bran's grey-muzzled puppies had taken up permanent, undignified residence, much to Grimshaw's carefully concealed delight. The tenant families no longer needed reminding to bring their tallies directly to the Duchess. Word had travelled, as word always does in a small county, that Ravensmoor's ledgers were honest now, down to the last farthing, and that its mistress could be trusted with far more than accounts. On a bright, cold morning in late autumn, Anna found her husband in the study before breakfast, bent over the household ledgers with an expression of theatrical suffering. "You are doing that on purpose," she said, settling into the chair across from him. No longer dragged noisily across the floor each time, for Nathaniel had quietly had a matching one placed there permanently, angled just so toward the fire, months ago. "Doing what, Your Grace?" "Frowning at perfectly ordinary figures, as though they have personally wronged you, so that I will take the ledger from your hands and do it myself. It has worked remarkably well for a year," he said, without a trace of shame, sliding the book across the desk. "I see no reason to abandon a successful strategy now." Anna laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh that still, after a year, made something in his chest go warm and slightly foolish, and took up the pen he had given her that very first autumn. It was over breakfast that she finally told him what she had suspected for some weeks, and confirmed only the day before, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had learned, at last, to trust good news when it arrived. Nathaniel set down his coffee with a hand that was, for the first time in Anna's experience, not entirely steady. "A child," he repeated, as though testing whether the words might dissolve if he said them too roughly. "By summer," Anna said, watching the severe, tired lines of his face rearrange themselves into something she had rarely seen there. Open, unguarded wonder. "Frances has already begun arguing with the housekeeper about nursery colors. I fear we shall have very little say in the matter." He came around the table without his cane, favoring his bad leg for the sake of speed, and knelt beside her chair to press his forehead briefly to hers. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, only the quiet, wordless language they had built together over a year of ledgers and firelight, and small, accumulating kindnesses. "I love you," he said simply, the words no longer strange in his low voice, though it had taken him the better part of a year to say them plainly, rather than in fountain pens and warmed towels and chairs dragged close to the fire. "I have, I think, since a snowy road outside Bath, though I did not have the sense to admit it until you were already soaked through and glaring at me over a teacup." "I love you too," Anna said, "though I will admit it took me rather longer to forgive you for the secrecy of it." "And have you?" "Forgiven me, almost entirely," she said, smiling against his mouth as he kissed her. "I shall let you know for certain once the nursery argument with Frances is settled." It was Bran, in the end, who revealed the last small secret of Ravensmoor Hall. though he did it, being a dog, entirely without meaning to. Grimshaw mentioned it in passing one afternoon, some months later, while helping to settle a fussing infant into Anna's arms for the first time, a small, dark-haired girl with her father's serious grey eyes, and Anna privately suspected her mother's stubbornness already evident in the set of her tiny jaw. "You will forgive me for saying so, Your Grace," the old butler said, permitting himself the faintest curve of a smile. But His Grace instructed the driveway to be left unrepaired that whole summer before you first arrived, on purpose. Mind. Said a woman worth marrying ought to have the chance to prove she'd walk the last mile rather than turn back at the gate. He'd already made up his mind about you a full fortnight before you ever knocked on that door. Though I will say, Your Grace," Grimshaw added, with the dry precision of a man settling an old grievance, "none of us anticipated quite so violent a storm that particular week." His Grace paced this study half the night, certain he had sent the coach driver home to a corpse on the road instead of a bride. Anna looked up sharply to find Nathaniel suddenly and unconvincingly absorbed in the fire. "You ruined the driveway," she said slowly, "on purpose." "The gravel needed replacing regardless," he said, entirely too innocent for a man whose ears had gone distinctly red. "I merely delayed the repairs by a season. I did not, I promise you, arrange the weather. That storm frightened me a good deal more than it frightened you, I suspect, and I have not slept easily through a hard rain since." Anna laughed until the baby in her arms startled and began indignantly to cry, and Bran lifted his grey head from the hearthrug to sigh at the both of them with the weary patience of a hound who had, in fact, known everything all along. "Did you enjoy this journey of Anna Vaughn, sent into a storm as a cruel joke, and rising instead to rule the halls of Ravensmoor as its beloved Duchess? If this story of quiet kindness, hidden devotion, and a love that grew in the warmth of a single offered chair moved you, please give it a like, share it with a friend who adores a slow-burning Regency romance, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale. Tell us in the comments, did you see the Duke's secret coming, or did it catch you as much by surprise as it caught Anna? Thank you for staying with us until the very last word.